Hey guys, back with some more Bazaar. I'm going to be having a look through the patch notes. We'll get straight into it. Some significant things happen, lots of XP changes, a lot of nerfs to Mac regen, and some other changes that probably needed to be made. First of all, we have the Proboscis. This is an obvious one. This enchantment didn't do anything, so I'm glad they removed it. It literally did nothing when you got that enchantment. Okay, so the core changes are pretty significant. Their scaling at diamond tier got improved significantly. 60 shield scaling instead of 40, I think makes sense in the late game. It used to be when you see someone running the core, you kind of think to yourself, what is this person doing? But now it'll be interesting to see whether that increased scaling makes the core viable in the late game. Okay, Brick Buddy, this cooldown makes a lot more sense. It was way too slow before, didn't really fit the meta of going quickly. And when you're trying to survive and you need a lot of shield, you need to go a little bit quicker than that, especially for something that reduces in the it scales in the fight. So you need it to go a little bit quicker. Cybersecurity changes, I think this makes sense as well. It already does a lot of damage, which I don't think necessarily needs to be changed. I think it's at a good level. But I think the cooldown changes do make sense. I think it becomes a little bit less relevant in the late game where you need to go a little bit faster. Forklifts enchants got changed. Its enchants was still for the old item before the rework, so they've just changed it so shield equal to this item's damage, and it's regular instead of shielding one for each item to the left of this, which doesn't really make that much sense. Hacksaw is an interesting change. So instead of just destroying a small item, it can destroy a small or medium item for the fight. So when you destroy an item during combat, you double the item's damage for the fight, which I think is interesting. And they've removed enemy from here. I assume this still destroys a small or medium item on your enemy's board for the fight. But the double the item's damage is interesting. It'll be interesting to see whether something like antimatter chamber or any other destruction gains any relevance. Next up, we have ignition core. Again, the increased scaling of diamond tier for the cores. Ignition core is already a monster, so it'll be interesting to see the change for that and if it's still relevant in the late game. Kinetic cannon got changed pretty significantly. The cooldown got reduced. It was way too slow before, so I think this makes sense. The damage scaling stayed the same at 25, 50, 75. However, now when you use a small item, you also charge the core for a second, which for something like the core, it would essentially double the speed of it. So it'll be interesting to see this on the right side of the core and it getting charged at the same time while core is going off super rapidly and also charging the kinetic cannon. It'll be interesting to see whether this is relevant at all. Next, we have Nitrogen Hammer. I really like this change. It starts at silver now, makes it easier to find and build around in the early game. You freeze one item for 1 second now instead of getting to 2 at diamond. It's just a 1 at all levels, which I also think makes sense. So when you freeze, you charge it a second, and the scaling has stayed the same at gold and diamond, but now it's 50 at silver. I really like this change. It means you just get to maybe find it a little bit earlier and build around it in the early game as dually. For dually, you wouldn't really find a lot of big freeze items early in the game, especially Nitrogen Hammer. You'd find it in the late game and you might already have a freeze build going and then use it. But usually you'd find it and throw it away because you're running something different. Whereas this, now you can find it and you build around it. Plasma Rifle kind of feels like the burn version of a Nitrogen Hammer now. It is slightly different. It does have 10 seconds of cooldown instead of 9, which I think makes sense since it has gained charge. The scaling is also a little bit worse, but yeah, the main thing is that now it charges for a second when you burn. I think this is much better than it was previously. It had a super long cooldown of 9 seconds without any charge. So being able to burn frequently on dually is something not unusual. So it'll be interesting to see how fast this goes off on a hyper burn dually build. Railgun is, I think, a decent change. The cooldown being increased by 1 second at silver, I don't think is super relevant, but I like the idea of having a slightly reduced cooldown at diamond. I think that makes some sense. The damage has stayed the same completely. which I also think is a good change. And now, Wallace, it's similar to Brick Buddy. The cooldown got reduced by 1 second. I think this makes sense. It's way too slow at 7 seconds. Weaponized core, same thing as the rest of the cores. The diamond tier scaling has increased, which I think makes a lot of sense. I'd be interested to see if people are still running that in the early game. Now we come to Adrenal Converter. I like this change. It didn't need to haste something for 2 seconds. It's already a great item with just poisoning yourself and gaining that regen. And hasting one item for 1 second is fine as well. Barbed Claws cooldown got increased to 6 seconds. I think this makes a lot of sense. It was one of the quickest weapons in the game at 5 seconds, 3 times multicast when both players have poison. I think it being as fast as an Uzi, sure. I'm not angry at that. I think it could honestly even go to 7 and it would be better, but I think it still contributes to the gotta go like really fast kind of better, but I think it's a good change. They're moving in the right direction. Basilisk Fang, I kind of like something that just makes sense in the context of the actual item. It's got the relic tag. I guess now it synergizes with Covetous Raven. But yeah, I mean, it's a cool last Fang, so it makes sense it would have a relic tag. This is one of the biggest changes for Mac is the Peace Wrought nerf. Cooldown got nerfed, so it's 1 second more each time. But the biggest thing is that now you don't get a chunk of lead anymore. So you still destroy the item to the left and get the regen equal to the value. However, you don't get the chunk of lead anymore, so you can't go through the infinites with something like a potion distillery. And you just can't get a ton of chunks of gold and just constantly scale it every single hour of the day. I think this is a good change. I will miss it because it's kind of what I've been running this patch. I've really enjoyed it. But yeah, I think it makes sense. And you do get a little bit of, a little bit of money for your trouble of actually destroying the item. Because when you destroy an item, you gain a certain amount of gold. So I guess it would, it's good for your economy now, I guess, just straight economy item. Because if you're destroying a bad item, like a small bronze tier item, you can destroy that and get more gold than what it would be worth. And if you're destroying a small bronze item, when this is a diamond tier, you're getting 8 gold instead. So I think it's a decent change. I think it makes sense. It was really, really strong. And I think bringing it down a tier or 2 does make a lot of sense. Next, we have Recycling Bin. I think giving it more regen, 369 instead of 234. Great change. I do like even doubling it, I think makes a lot of sense. Its randomness means that it's already not a really feasible item. So I think the regen aspect of it does need to be really strong in order to make it relevant, because it just transforming potions into something random doesn't really make a lot of sense for a lot of builds. It just feels too random and doesn't do a lot. Shard of Obsidian's cooldown got increased by 1 second. This makes a lot of sense. It's a reagent and it really isn't acting like one. People are putting it on their board most of the time instead of actually transforming it, because it's a 4 second lifesteal weapon. So that it was already phenomenal, and honestly, even at 5 seconds, it still is not that bad. But now at least it's slightly worse than the Basilisk Fang, which has a 4 second cooldown. It was almost equivalent to this thing. At that 4 second cooldown, it was much easier to find as well. Next, we have the Sifting Pan. It has a hidden regen tag now, which makes sense. Staff of the Moose starts at gold. This is another big change to Mac regen. It's going to be a lot harder to find this, and it's going to be a lot harder to make a regen build centered around this now. Finding a large item at gold is already difficult, and it's just another item that you won't be able to find until like day 6, 7, if you're lucky. And it'll just be really difficult to find. And it did get nerfed a little bit. It starts at 1 second instead of 1.5 at gold, and it's 2 seconds at diamond, which is the same. The regen did get nerfed a little bit. I don't really know why. I don't think this bit was the issue with it. I think it did just kind of need a nerf for a rule, so I think it does make sense. But I'm not a fan of it going up to gold. I can see why it needed a nerf, but it's just going to be a lot more difficult to find now and actually make a build around, which I don't think is what needed changing. I think the item itself needed a change. Test Subject Alpha is a really relevant change. It kind of sucked compared to the other items in Max Expansion. Now it's gotten its cooldown reduced, which is really great. And it's also gotten its poison reduced, which I think, increased, which I think for Mac makes a lot of sense. He's going to have a lot of life steal, a lot of heal, a lot of regen. So poisoning more with it makes a lot more sense. Vial Launcher is another good change. It did need its damage increased. Potions are kind of by themselves not super relevant at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if you can have a really quick potion build with something like this to get a lot of scaling. Next, we have pig items that it got changed. So now we have the Atlas Stone. And now the Atlas Stone starts at bronze. And it goes from 9, 8, 7 to 6. Which I think if we're going to change it to bronze, silver, gold, and diamond, I think that makes sense. However, I don't see it being super relevant. Having a 9-second cooldown, and it's only going to be doing 1 damage at the start in the early game. I don't think that's super relevant. We'll see, but I don't think it's very good. Beehive, this is a much needed buff. You get barely any bees anymore. So increasing the scaling, I think the scaling should have been increased at silver as well, honestly. But you don't get many bees anymore, so I think this is super relevant. I think that's a great change. Ice Club is an interesting one. The cooldown got reduced. However, the charge also got reduced, which I think makes a lot of sense. You now need 5 charges, 5 instances of freeze to make it proc, versus having 4. And then when you have something like a phonograph, it goes down to 5 and it needs 3 charges instead of going down to 6 and only needing 2 charges. So I think that is a really great change to the Giant Ice Club. Obviously a super strong item. Pig Freeze as well. Still a super relevant build. Hality I think is also a great change. It was way too quick for a multicast damage item. It was really strong with something like the Jabalian Drum. So I think the slight cooldown increase makes a lot of sense. And finally, the Jabalian Drum got nerfed. So instead of 5, 10, 15 damage, we now have 3, 6, and 9, which is probably still okay, honestly. But yeah, this has missed a couple of patches and it's been really strong the whole time. I'm glad they finally nerfed it. I think that's a good change. Rinking Gauntlet's cooldown got increased. I think this makes sense. It's a multicast item and it's a small, kind of similar to the Hality, except it has more base damage due to your income. I think this is a really, really good change. It does make sense. Now we have Showcase. I think this is also a great change. The scaling got reduced slightly. This thing is a early and mid-game menace. And I think now with the reduction of XP and everyone's HP pool being decreased, the reduction of the damage scaling and the shield scaling does make a lot of sense. Snowmobile changes. So, this is a really good change, I think. It makes it maybe relevant. Who knows? It still doesn't have any damage scaling, which I think will be a bad... Well, it does have damage scaling on use, but not on the instance of hasting or freezing. However, now it's a lot quicker. We go from 8, 7 to 6 instead of just at 7. And instead of gaining haste or when you freeze, it's just when you haste or freeze now, you get the charge for 2 seconds. So it's a lot quicker, which is great because it only gets to scale on use. So I think that does make a lot of sense for an item like the Snowmobile. I think that's a good change. Now to go Vanessa items. For some reason, the monkey is aquatic now. I guess that little guy can swim. I don't know why he's aquatic. Pesky Pete changes. This is a really great change. He was irrelevant. This +4 and +8 burn means nothing. I'm glad that now instead he has multicast. I think this is interesting. I think 7-second burn item with a 3 times multicast makes it one of the quickest burn items in the game. It's going to be quicker than something like a lighter, which is really interesting to see. It has more casts per second. Water wheel changes, I also think this is super relevant. No one was playing water wheel, everyone's playing dive weights and other haste items on Vanessa. Water wheel is super irrelevant, it just takes up too much space. So I think the cooldown reduction makes a lot of sense. And the 2 skill changes is basically Into the Void is gotten hit by the no more start of fight exclusive skills, basically. And now it's instead the first time you use an item, you destroy an item on each player's board for the fight, which I think is a lot more interesting. So if you have something like a big one-shot build, like a Long John or maybe a Hammer on Pig, this is honestly not a horrible skill now, because at least you get a hit off before you destroy something. It's not just maybe going to destroy your best item at the start of the fight and you can't do anything. Next skill that got reworked is Small Refresh. This is a much needed change. Now it's limited instead of just being unlimited heal. Um, the actual amount hasn't changed, but I think this is super relevant. Obviously, with the burn and poison changes with heal, it cleansing 10% every single time you use a small item, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think small refresh here was a really good change. So I think that does make a lot of sense. Okay, so now we move on to more of the general changes, more of the big changes instead of the items. So all of the heroes' starting health is increased by 50. This makes a lot of sense given the XP changes that we're about to talk about. Everyone is going to have a lot less HP this patch. So I think that does make a lot of sense, seeing that change. So some more general changes. So some other items. Colossal Popsicle apparently was giving you enchanted icicles. And they also had an issue where icicles spawned that didn't actually match the tier. Sure. Encounters, big changes here in terms of XP and monsters as well. So, Mount Pass only spawns on day 4 to 7. I think this is a good change. There's not much more of the whole XP economy in the early game now. You're not clicking on this every single time you see it anymore, maybe. Although, with the exclusivity of XP in the whole game, I think it'll be a little bit more relevant. So now it only spawns on day 4 to 7. Study, so gaining XP, it no longer spawns on day 3. Tiny furry monster, so there's no more XP option here. So there's no more getting a friend, getting food, getting a toy in order to get XP. And now you get given a choice of 2 skills instead, which I think is also a really interesting change. And I think that's great. No more Radiant on starting Enchanted, which, it's a buff for that start, but like it goes to show how bad Radiant is. Which I think honestly just needs to be reverted to what it was. It just needs to be able to be targeted by slow, by freeze, by this destroy, instead of it targeting other items on your board. Um, and then it negates those things. Because Radiant isn't as great as other enchantments at the moment. The only time it's really good is if you have a one weapon build and you just want that item, that one weapon to go off. It doesn't make much sense otherwise. Okay, so monster changes. This is again the same as the XP things. Don't know why Hexer is turned off. However, the rewards are changed. The XP down the right here is looking very different. So bronze, silver, gold is all 2 XP, and then diamond is 3, legendary is 3 XP, and the gold rewards are still kind of the same. They still are the same, I believe. I think that this is a really interesting change. I like the direction that they're going in with this. I think XP is such a major part of the game, and getting to level 3 on day 2, getting to level 4 on day 3 was such a relevant and important thing in order to win those fights. And now that's gone. You can't get there. So I think this is a really, really good change. And it means that you take a fight for the sake of that fight rather than going for the XP. I think this makes sense. I think maybe it needs a little bit of touch up. I think maybe when you get into the late game, taking some of these fights maybe makes a little bit more sense. But then when you get bad RNG of something like Void Golem or another tougher legendary fight instead of something easier, I think it can kind of generate a big gap in XP. And especially in the early game when people get 2 to 3 levels ahead, especially Vanessa's, and you get into the late game and they have, 2000 HP on you, I think it can be really tricky to deal with that. Yeah, I think these XP changes overall are a good thing. I think we're going to see a big shift into pure damage being back because everyone has no HP, but I think overall it's a move in the right direction for the game. So, overall, I think this is a really great patch. I think it makes a lot of sense, all of the changes to specific items that they've made. I think there are a select few which maybe aren't amazing. However, it's just a handful, and I don't think it's necessarily super relevant. I think the most interesting thing is obviously the XP changes. It'll be interesting to see people who aren't able to get ahead now, and I think this is definitely the most impactful change. And I guess we'll just see how that develops throughout the game. But yeah, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do whatever you want, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.